Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And I emphasize the and civic responsibility because I think during a conversation yesterday with Bob on the air, it became very clear that we were right on the edge of civic responsibility in our conversation yesterday, and that's pretty much what we were talking about in our conversation. Was to even more precisely define the role for government, at least in theory, as Jefferson seemed to endorse it in the Declaration of Independence as he originally drafted it. And there's absolutely no question that what he was talking about was government's role in promoting the happiness of the community at large. And the promotion of that happiness is not the direct delivery of goods and services from government. It's government efforts to encourage citizens themselves to do what they can for their fellow man and to put the public interest, at least in some cases, ahead of their private interest, and to look at their private interest primarily as a way of contributing more meaningfully to the public interest. I mean, that, in a nutshell, it seems to me, that's what the Scottish Enlightenment ideas were all about. And it seems to me that over the last several weeks, we have been able here at the Virtual Center to emphasize the extent to which this idea of the pursuit of happiness as an inalienable right and government's principal responsibility may really be what Jefferson's Declaration was all about. I think it's a fantastic concept, and what has to happen is that it needs to be put on the table and it needs to be discussed, and the closed book on the orthodox idea of the Declaration of Independence as Lockean, as based on man's individual freedom to acquire and the need to protect property in the state of nature, is really what government is all about. If you think about it, there are certain people that would want citizens at large to accept that and believe it and never question that. Think about who they are, and I think you can begin to get some idea as to why what we're doing here at the Virtual Center is so significant, I really believe. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I say that. I just came from a Rotary meeting here in southern West Virginia, in Beckley, and I was telling Bob, I only had a minute or two to chat with Bob before we went on the air today, but I have to tell you, it was one of the more exhilarating meetings that I've ever been to, and it began with some of the most depressing information, and basically the program presenter was Karen Bowling, who's a local name here in southern West Virginia, who is a nurse and a hospital executive. She was CEO of one of our local hospitals here in southern West Virginia, and a year ago, on the 1st of July last year, she was asked by the governor of West Virginia to accept the office as secretary of the Division of Health and Human Resources. She took it, and she's a dynamo, and what she was doing was laying out some of the data, some of the hard numbers that kind of tell everybody where West Virginia is in the overall area of health. And of course everybody knew that, and several people came in and said, I know what she's going to do. She's going to open with those numbers, and we don't need them. Fact of the matter is we do. And I think that some of the activities that she's involved in order to move some of these numbers is very significant. I was telling Bob that, and I didn't write all the numbers down. She had a whole slide of the numbers, but the ones I do remember, West Virginia is 49th in preventable hospitalizations. We are 47th in the instances of smoking. We are 47th in obesity. We are 45th in terms of and I'm trying to think of some of the others, heart disease and activity, the less activity. We're 45th in the area of activity, and on and on and on. And Karen pointed out, which I think is probably the most devastating number of all, is that these numbers have not changed for 20 years. In other words, all we've been doing for the last 2 decades here in West Virginia is kind of dancing around the edges. But I would suggest to you that the same kind of inactivity, if you will, in some of those numbers is undoubtedly true in other states as well. We don't know how, the abuse of drugs, for example, substance abuse, we're up near the top. But the fact of the matter is, people wonder how to take it down. One of the things she was emphasizing was the attention on children, and the state has made a decision to do everything they can to try to talk about children in terms of limiting alcohol and drug use during pregnancies, and the idea of finding ways for state agencies to respond after delivery of babies in order to do everything that is necessary in the first few months of a child's life in addressing the issue of substance abuse, if it indeed is a factor in the pregnancy. And one of the things she's talking about, and this is the up number in West Virginia, and I'm so excited about sharing this with you. West Virginia is 6th, not 46th, 6th among all the states in the proportion of its people with health insurance. West Virginia embraced the Affordable Care Act from the very beginning. The governor made the decision to expand our Medicaid rolls right away with no objection. And West Virginia has moved. Our target, she mentioned that West Virginia's target for enrolling new people in health care was 94,000 new people by 2016. Already, West Virginia has enrolled 134,000. Granted, population-wise, we're one of the smallest states. But proportionally, we're near the top of something. And I think that got standing ovation, because we're used to being told we're last in everything. And now what she announced was an initiative called Coverage to Care. And they're beginning a media blitz, and what they're going to do is talk to the people who for the first time in their lives have health care coverage and tell them what to do with it, because basically health insurance is meaningless until you use it. So what they're doing is emphasizing getting newly covered folks together with their doctors in order to talk about areas and initiatives, personal ones, in order to take the initiative, if you will, in personal health and preventive care.
Hey, Dr. Bill.
Yes, Bob.
Sorry to jump in so quick, and I'll go away as quickly as I can. But in relation to what you're talking about here, you might be interested in some breaking news.
Okay.
Two separate rulings were issued today by the U.S. Courts of Appeals, one in the Fourth Circuit in Richmond and one in the D.C. Circuit in, obviously, D.C.
Yes.
Both of the cases were challenging whether or not the federal government may subsidize insurance purchase through the Federal Exchange.
Yes.
The Fourth Circuit in Richmond said yes, that the subsidy was as issued by the IRS was what they described as a permissible exercise of the agency's discretion. Mm-hmm. However, the D.C. Circuit, which the Republicans in the Senate have managed to keep from having as many Democratic appointees as one might have, there's a terrible backlog because of the number of judges and vacancies that are out there.
That's right.
But the D.C. Circuit ruled that no, people can only have subsidies if they purchase through a state exchange, which of course is this is a calculated assault, another calculated assault on the idea of Americans being able to go to the doctor when they're sick.
Right.
Because you've got, well, for instance, Kentucky set up its own state exchange, so they're excluded from this ruling.
Right.
West Virginia, however, took a bunch of millions of dollars and then said, oh, we took all the money to set up a state exchange, but we're not going to do that. We're going to go with the federal exchange. Mm-hmm. So since there's a conflict between the circuits, Fourth and the D.C. Circuit, that automatically means that this will go to the Supreme Court. Or almost automatically.
Oh, wow.
So the folks that I refer to as the rats, because their initials are Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia, are going to get to decide whether or not the subsidies can be used in the federal exchanges.
Right.
Would you care to guess how that's going to come down?
Yeah, it's kind of scary, isn't it? Well, it flies in the face of everything we've been talking about with the Declaration in terms of government's responsibility to promote the pursuit of happiness among the people.
Well, exactly, and it also, I think it makes it plain that there is an element in this country. Let's remember, the Affordable Care Act is a giant welfare giveaway, and even though I'm supportive of it, I have to acknowledge what it is. It's a giant giveaway to the insurance companies.
Of course it is. Of course it is. It has nothing to do, the Affordable Care Act has much less to do with health care than it does with health insurance. And basically, it buys into the model of free enterprise and private delivery, and Obama did that on the assumption that it would garner support for the program. And, of course, the irony is that's what they're suing him about.
Well, exactly, and it becomes clear that there is a cadre, an element of people in this country, and we know who they are, who absolutely want people, American citizens, within the purview of that, provide for the general welfare, all of that. Right. There's a cadre of people in this country, Dr. Bill, that, like it or not, we have to, if we're going to face facts, we're going to have to realize that group of people wants American citizens to die of preventable illness.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, Bob. I see where you're coming from. It's a pretty dire conclusion, but I mean, it's hard to argue against.
Well, what else is there, Dr. Bill?
No, there isn't. There isn't another way. I agree with you.
I mean, there's another way to deliver health care.
There sure is, and it's the single provider approach.
Yeah, universal single payer.
Universal, right.
But do you think the Koch brothers are going to start running ads calling for single payer?
No, they're sure not. They're sure not. But I think they're creating a circumstance which is liable to produce a groundswell. If they do anything to derail significant elements of the Affordable Care Act, then I think they're going to, and I think it would be a so-called Pyrrhic victory, because I think that even if they won that, they would end up dealing with universal health care. So in a sense, it could be a blessing in disguise, although it would be very painful for the people that it hurts in the short term.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what the scheduling on this will be relative to the November elections.
Yeah.
Obviously, the court is more or less out of session now, and they will not return until the first Monday in October.
First Monday in October, right. And, of course, that gives them 1 month. And so the question is, will this even be on the docket before the November elections on the second Tuesday?
Right.
So,
but it also becomes a political question that is unanswered as of Election Day in November.
Yeah, you're right. Paul.
And I wonder if there are any Democrats out there who will have the courage to campaign and say, listen, you've got health care now. I want you to keep having health care.
Right. Well, that's kind of what the meeting that I attended today was about, and it ended on, it was a very positive note, and it was a good presentation in that sense, because it took the most negative numbers, and for the first time you kind of left there with the idea, finally we may be able to do something about these numbers. And of course, numbers reflect people, and that's the most important aspect of this. But anyway, Bob, I appreciate your input very much. I did not know about those two.
Well, I had a feeling you didn't, and I thought it might color your consideration of the issue.
It does, and I I really believe that we're not done with the Affordable Care Act in terms of its impact. I think that the efforts of those to convince people that it was going to be an abject failure and could never work, have been overcome. But it's obvious that that efforts to stymie the legislation and its impact and its successful impact have not ceased and will not continue to cease.
Well, you might be. One last thing, you might be interested to know, Dr. Bill, that one of the plaintiffs in these cases is a fellow by the name of David Klemenchik.
Why do I know that name?
Well, you don't. But he's from Ellenboro, West Virginia. And in the caption to the New York Times article, he is quoted as saying, "If I have to start paying out for health insurance, it will put me out of business. As Americans, we should be able to make our own decisions in matters like this."
Yeah. Wow.
Well, did it never occur to this character that if he has a heart attack, he's out of business too? Or cancer?
Yeah. Oh, man. Bob, I thank you.
Well, I know.
I appreciate
I just wanted you to have that info. Thanks, Dr. Bill.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you. Let me take time before we get into a little bit of the 18th century today to share with you our phone number and invite you to participate. I think you just heard Bob's input into the program. It's very simple. It's just conversation. It's just additional information. And please don't assume that Bob Kincaid and or me are the two people with any kind of lock on information and insight by any stretch. We know that the people who listen to this program and to the Head On Radio Network bring a level of sophistication and depth to these issues that I think all of us can benefit from, and that's the idea. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly on a personal basis, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. We kind of left yesterday's program. We were, if you remember, the end game for yesterday's program was to wrap up our consideration of Gary Wills's book, Inventing America, and hopefully to move on toward the Constitution and specifically towards the Federalist Papers and Gary Wills's contribution to our understanding of the Federalist Papers in his book, Explaining America, which was written after the Inventing America book. And I'm remiss here because I neglected to give you the exact publication date for this book. It was originally published in 1981. So the Inventing America book was published in 1978. So in a 3-year period, Wills moved from Jefferson's Declaration to the Federalist Papers. And in his conclusion to Explaining America, he talks about taking on the issue of ratification. Since that time, in fact, in the prologue to the latest edition, the latest printing of Explaining America, he mentions that his initial research in the area of ratification has suggested to him that this would be too ambitious a task. However, one of the things that occurred to me immediately when I read that is that Pauline Maier, who just passed away this past year, in 2010 came out with her book on ratification, which does a phenomenal job of addressing the latest research available on the issues of ratification in all of the state ratification conventions in 1787, 1788. The project from which she was able to draw her research continues to move forward. At the time, 2010, that Pauline Maier wrote her book on ratification, the ratification project at the University of Wisconsin, under the editorship of John Kaminsky, had completed 8 of the 13 states. This year, in my last email exchange with John Kaminsky, which was some months ago, suggested that the state they were working on now is Maryland, and the reason that John Kaminsky let me know that is because my dissertation was on ratification in the state of Maryland. And John called to let me know that they were putting the volume together on the Maryland ratification story, and that they had copies of my dissertation at their elbow, so to speak. So what I've been able to do, and again, I wrote my dissertation in the 70s. I received my degree in 1979. So what I've been able to do is provide an overall context for the ratification story in Maryland. So even if some of my interpretations, which were made 30 years ago, might have been superseded based on additional research that's been done since then, the overall context of the ratification story is pretty well laid out in my dissertation. And consequently, I think that just for the organizational contribution itself, I think my dissertation would make a meaningful contribution to the overall effort. I'm guessing that the project folks have probably already completed Maryland and are probably moving into another state at this point. I don't know that. But at some point in time, all 13 states are going to be completed. And I don't think Gary Wills, in 1981, when he published his Explaining America and took on ratification, especially when he realized the size of the project that he was, the size of the bite that he was taking. The availability of Pauline Maier's book on ratification and the extent to which she was able to pull together an awful lot of the latest and only existent research would suggest that the overall effort to address the issue of ratification for Gary Wills would probably be a lot more manageable now than it may have been when he made the decision that it was so overwhelming a project that he was kind of backing off taking it on. But I don't know that. But one of the things that we left unfinished yesterday, if you remember, we were looking at the concluding chapters in Jefferson's on the book on Jefferson and the Inventing America book by Gary Wills. The last 2 chapters of Gary Wills's book Inventing America, not the last 2 chapters, the last 2 units, address the issue of the Declaration of Independence as a sentimental paper, and the last unit address it as national symbol. You'll remember that the overall organizational structure of Inventing America, Gary Wills's book, was to look at the Declaration from different perspectives, and we've done that in the last several weeks here at the Virtual Center. The initial section of the book looked at the context of the Declaration of Independence as a revolutionary charter. In other words, a statement of the justifications and reasons for American independence. In other words, a political document, a political statement to the nation and the world as to what we were doing and why we felt the need to do it. His first group of chapters focused principally on looking at the Declaration within the political context within which it happened. His second section, and this is where he really gets deeply into the Scottish Enlightenment thinking and its contribution to the Declaration, the second unit is entitled, it looks at the Declaration as a scientific document. And when we touched on that particular aspect of the book, we talked about the Enlightenment and about the impact of Isaac Newton and his discovery of universal laws governing the universe, and the extent to which Enlightenment thinkers began to look at the overall structure and the overall operation of science. And we talked about the Enlightenment itself and the changes that it made in the way people looked at the world that they lived in. And we focused on Francis Hutchinson, and as well as Thomas Jefferson, David Hume, and some of the others, on the extent to which they tended to look at the universe and at societies as operational structures, almost as organic entities that had moving parts. And you remember, we spent quite a bit of time talking about Jefferson's support and affection for David Rittenhouse, the noted scientist in Philadelphia who was able to construct a model of the universe with moving parts, planets and stars and all the rest of it, and everything moved in sync. And it was an effort to reproduce demonstrably the organization and the operation of the universe as it was explained by Isaac Newton. And Jefferson was just captivated with that. And if you look at his notes on the state of Virginia and some of his private writings, he was captivated with the idea of not only the universe as a mechanism, but the human body as a mechanism. The political structure of a particular nation, the republic, as an organic functioning mechanism. The economy as a mechanism, and we cited some, I think, very pertinent quotes from Adam Smith, in which Adam Smith looked at the functioning of the international commercial model of trade and productivity and the free exchange of goods and ideas as system, and we spent quite a bit of time on that approach. And then we looked, after we looked at it at the Declaration as a scientific paper, we looked at it as a moral paper. And we looked at the whole issue of morality. And specifically, we looked at the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers' idea of man's moral sense and the extent to which man's moral sense was the basis for arguments about human equality. And the implication, of course, is clear that when Jefferson opens the Declaration, his most relevant preamble paragraph, by suggesting that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, we were able to trace the origins of that statement back to the idea of man's moral sentiments and the extent to which it was the basis of man's equality. And we looked at some of the science of the period that reinforced that. And the irony is that one of the names most associated with this idea of initial equality when people come into the world is John Locke, and his idea in his essay on moral sentiments, his essay on human understanding, about man as being a tabula rasa, and that man comes into the world blank, and that everything man is and becomes and can become is based on his experiences, on his education, on the social circumstances within which he is forced to live and to grow. And we talked about that. And we talked about the equality aspects of that particular phenomenon and the whole idea of morality. And then within the moral framework of this way of looking at issues, we talked about the development of the Republic and the extent to which the Republic's mission was in part moral. More specifically, the extent to which Jefferson accepted that and seemingly built it into his Declaration. When he talked about the responsibility, government's responsibility to protect man's natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yesterday, we focused our attention specifically on what Jefferson, Hutchison, Adam Ferguson, David Hume, and Adam Smith meant by happiness. And in their frame of reference, they talked about government's responsibility to promote the public interest. In other words, to promote a sense of civic duty and civic responsibility and to encourage benevolence in society, with the idea that man's happiness is based not on what he receives from others, but what he can do for others. How ironic that what we are talking about here is the golden rule. What we are talking about here is Matthew's gospel. What we are talking about here is a theological approach to men living together, which is so much a part of our Christian heritage. And yet today, we find so many Christians who refuse to accept that message as God's major message. And especially, we resist efforts to suggest that that might have been Jefferson's message at all. Because, and this is in the realm of political opinion here, so many of today's most outspoken critics of this approach have become anti-Jefferson because Jefferson was not a Christian in the context in which these other people consider themselves Christians. So we have here before us, I believe, a major contradiction in the part of many of the nation's more conservative, those folks who argue that America is at heart a Christian nation, refuse to address this aspect of Christianity, which in reality is probably the one approach on which their philosophy could acquire some credibility. But be that as it may. And then the last couple of sections on the Declaration are the Declaration as a sentimental paper, and the last one addresses the Declaration of Independence as a national symbol. And we basically spotted the origins of this in the writing and speeches of Abraham Lincoln 100 years after the fact, in the 1850s and 60s. At the end of the program yesterday, we were focusing on one particular aspect of the Declaration, and more than anything else, what it was all about. And this is very important to me because I believe, through all of this, I have believed, I continue to believe, that this is the most important consideration to keep before us. And that is the political circumstances which produced the Declaration. You can talk about the scientific aspects of it, the moral aspects of it. You can talk about all of these other things. But the fact of the matter is, in its own time and in its own place, the Declaration of Independence was drafted for a particular purpose. And as you read the Declaration, there's no question but that the overall intent of the Declaration was to justify the right of the American colonies to be independent from Great Britain, and the rationalization for that belief, for that argument. There is absolutely no question that when you cut away all the cover, all the related and secondary issues, there is absolutely no question that more than anything else at its time, the colony's need for foreign help in order to secure independence and fight the war against Great Britain was paramount. There's no question that it was very obvious that the leaders in Congress realized that if the colonies did not take the step and declare their independence, there was no way that potential allies in the world, specifically the Netherlands and France, could risk war with Great Britain in defense of the American colonies. The only way that the colonies felt that they could secure dependable aid from these prospective foreign allies was to declare their independence. And so in a sense, one could say that all the possible aspects of the Declaration seem to coalesce down into this one issue. The principal purpose of the Declaration of Independence was to make it possible to secure financial aid, foreign aid, for American independence. And I wanted to just cite a few examples of that to support it. On March 2nd, 1776, a couple of months before the Declaration, John Penn wrote from Philadelphia the following: "The consequence of making alliances is perhaps a total separation with Britain, and without something of that sort, we may not be able to provide what is necessary for our defense." Unquote. In other words, if we don't declare our independence, if we don't send a message to France and the Netherlands that we're really serious about this, then chances are they won't be willing to step up and do what we need them to do for our own defense. And then in June, during the debates in the Continental Congress, just prior to the appointment of the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's own notes on the debates in the Continental Congress state the following, if you'll bear with me. These are Jefferson's own notes on the debates. That a Declaration of Independence alone could render it consistent with European delicacy for European powers to treat with us, or even to receive an ambassador from us. That till this, they would not receive our vessels into their ports, nor acknowledge the adjudications of our courts of admiralty to be legitimate in cases of capture of British vessels. That though France and Spain may be jealous of our rising power, they must think it will be much more formidable with the addition of Great Britain, and will therefore see it their interest to prevent a coalition. But should they refuse, we shall be but where we are, whereas without trying, we shall never know whether they will aid us or not." Jefferson goes on, "That the present campaign may be unsuccessful, and therefore we had better propose an alliance while our affairs wear a hopeful aspect. That to wait the event of this campaign will certainly work daily, because during this summer France may assist us effectually by cutting off those supplies of provisions from England and Ireland on which the enemy's armies here are to depend, or by setting in motion the great power they have collected in the West Indies, and calling our enemy to the defense of the possessions they have there. In other words, specifically mentioning, Jefferson does in his notes, the very specific military benefits to the colonies that France will provide when we make the decision to go for independence. They will make it more difficult for England to supply its own troops here in the 13 colonies, and they will force England to divert some of their military strength in defending the West Indies against France. All of this will benefit us. Jefferson goes on, that it would be idle to lose time in settling the terms of alliance till we had first determined we would enter into alliance. In other words, we would be wasting our time to talk about the specifics of an alliance with France, Spain, the Netherlands, anybody, until we first make the decision to be independent enough to enter into an alliance at all. And then Jefferson says that it is necessary to lose no time in opening a trade for our people, who will want clothes and will want money too for the payment of taxes. People's day-to-day lives will depend on our willingness to do this. And then Jefferson, in his notes, closes with the following paragraph. And that the only misfortune is that we did not enter into alliance with France 6 months sooner, as besides opening their ports for the vent of our last year's produce, they might have marched an army into Germany and prevented the petty princes there from selling their unhappy subjects to seduce us, the Hessian troops. If we had acted 6 months before, Germany might not have been able to afford to supply the Hessian troops that are now here in the colonies under the pay and control of the British. So Jefferson lays all of these advantages out in his notes as to why we need a Declaration of Independence. Gary Wills makes the point after citing this particular quotation from Jefferson's notes. Gary Wills' conclusion is, it's clear from the notes how every aspect of the motion for independence was attacked and justified in terms of one thing: aid to be won from France. But this is the argument for those Americans in the know. This was the argument, these were the issues being debated in the Congress as background to the decision to declare independence. But what about the people at large? What about the ability of the general population to understand why we ought to be independent? History tells us that the most significant activity in that vein, on that score, was the publication in 1776 of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, in which Thomas Paine made the logical, reasonable, common sense case as to why these colonies ought to be independent and ought not to be controlled from an island 3,000 miles away with a population that was only 1/10 the size of our own. And in his Common Sense, Thomas Paine concludes with the following. He says, to conclude, however strange it may appear to some, or however unwilling they may be to think so matters not. But many strong and striking reasons may be given to show that nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined declaration for independence, some of which are, and then Thomas Paine goes and makes the case to the people of America, people of the world. First reason, second reason, third reason, fourth reason. Let me give you a taste. Paine says, first, it is the custom of nations, when any two of them are at war, for some other powers not engaged in the quarrel to step in as mediators and bring about the preliminaries of peace. But while America calls herself the subject of Great Britain, no power, however well disposed she may be, can offer her mediation. Wherefore, in our present state, we may quarrel on forever. In other words, we can't be half independent and not independent. We can't remain part of the empire and yet at war with Great Britain. Because until we resolve it by going one way or the other, no other nation can mediate, can intervene, and bring this thing to an end. We'll be fighting forever, Thomas Paine says. That's his first argument. Second, it is unreasonable to suppose that France or Spain will give us any kind of assistance if we mean only to make use of that assistance for the purpose of repairing the breach and strengthening the connection between Britain and America, because those powers would be sufferers by the consequences. In other words, there's no way that we can expect France, Spain, or anybody else to help us if once they stick their necks out, so to speak, we take the aid they gave us and turn around and patch it up with Great Britain and leave them hanging. They can't afford to do that, and they won't. So that's the second argument Thomas Paine makes. You can begin to see, and I know Common Sense is one of those books that none of us have ever read because every one of us knows what it's about, that it's common sense that we be independent. But how much of the arguments have we taken the time, have our teachers taken the time to go into with us? Here's Thomas Paine saying, the reason we have to go for independence is first, because nobody can mediate the struggle and the war until we make the decision. Second, France and Spain and other nations that might be willing to come to our aid can't afford to do it if there's any chance in the world that we might repair our relations with the mother country. So in order to get that aid and support, we got to make the decision to go. Thirdly, Thomas Paine says, while we profess ourselves to be subjects of Britain, we must, in the eye of foreign nations, be considered as rebels. The precedent is somewhat dangerous to their peace for men to be in arms under the name of subjects. We on the spot can solve the paradox, but to unite resistance and subjection requires an idea much too refined for common understanding. As long as we continue to insist that we are citizens of the mother country, and at the same time we fight a war against the mother country, we're rebels. No country is going to put its foreign policy on the line to support a revolution, to support rebels. Because the message to rebels, potential rebels within their own countries, is something that none of them could afford to risk. And then finally, fourth, were a manifesto to be published, a Declaration of Independence, and dispatched to foreign courts, setting forth the miseries we have endured and the peaceable methods we have ineffectually used for redress, declaring at the same time that not being able any longer to live happily or safely under the cruel disposition of the British court, we had been driven to the necessity of breaking off all connections with her, at the same time assuring all such courts of our peaceable dispositions toward them and of a desire of entering into trade with them. Such a memorial would produce more good effects to this continent than if a ship were freighted with petitions to Britain. If we can make the case that Britain is the offender here, and we are the victims, and we are only doing what we had no choice to do. In other words, Thomas Paine is outlining the argument that Jefferson needs to take in the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson follows it to the letter. And then Thomas Paine concludes his book, Common Sense, with the following. Under our present denomination of British subjects, we can neither be received nor heard abroad. The custom of all courts is against us, and will be so until by an independence we take rank with other nations. Once we declare our independence, we become the same. We establish a degree of respect that we cannot ever have as long as we continue to profess that we are loyal subjects of Great Britain and its king. And here's Thomas Paine's conclusion. These proceedings may at first appear strange and difficult, but like all other steps which we have already passed over, will in a little time become familiar and agreeable. And until an independence is declared, the continent will feel itself like a man who continues putting off some unpleasant business from day to day, yet knows it must be done, hates to set about doing it, wishes it were over, and is continually haunted with the thought of its necessity. How real is that? How many times have we labored over unpleasant decisions that we've had to make in our own lives? If any of you have ever managed other employees and have ever had to terminate anybody, and you don't sleep the night before, and you agonize, and you pace the floor, and you worry about their family, and worry whether they're going to make it or not, whether there's going to be food enough for the kids, and all these other issues. And Thomas Paine taps right into that. He's tapping right into the souls of human beings. And he's allowing people who read him to actually become participants in the process. Once you read Thomas Paine, you can't help but seeing the logic of the case that he has made. It is brilliant. Not only has he made the case for members of Congress, he has made the case for the general public at large. And in the process, he has provided Jefferson with an outline of how to structure the Declaration of Independence. I think, don't tell me that youngsters in our schools can't read and understand Thomas Paine and what he's saying. But again, as a teacher, you can't just assign it and say, go home and read Thomas Paine and we'll discuss it next week and expect to get any positive results. You've got to throw it out there so that everybody understands, even the weak readers, even the people who say, I read this at home, but I really wasn't sure. Am I right when I think Thomas Paine is saying this? And am I right when I think Thomas Paine is saying that? But when students hear it, when they hear the argument, and they are able to put themselves into the historical situation, In other words, they become participants in the decision for American independence. They will understand the circumstances and the origins of the war for American independence as no numbers of lectures would ever get the message across to them. Thomas Paine says that a case well made to the world will do more good than a ship loaded with petitions to the British king. Exposing students to the words of Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, and doing everything we can do to make sure that they understand it, and considering the fact that some people are better readers than others, so making sure that everybody's getting it, you will do more to contribute to student understanding of what the American War for Independence is all about then I don't care how many lectures on the topic you deliver, because the lectures you deliver are your own. The conclusion that students reach by reaching the resources are their own. Once they engage it, once they take possession of it, once they know what it's all about, because they have allowed themselves to become part of the decision itself, they will understand. And once they do understand, then they can participate in discussions about alternatives. They could participate or engage in what I like to call what-if history. What if somebody other than Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence? What if Congress hadn't made the changes in Jefferson's first draft that it made? Would we, trying to understand what's in Jefferson's head, would we have nearly the trouble that we seem to have if we read his first draft rather than the final product? The best example that I can give us of that, go back to the Bill of Rights. Look at the proposed amendments that the House of Representatives, in the person of James Madison, delivered to the United States Senate in the first Congress of the United States in 1791. And then look at the Bill of Rights as it came out of the Senate. Compare what went in and compare what went out. And you can begin to get a sense of the real issues associated with that particular document. The situation is no different with the Declaration. It's no different with the Constitution. But the first step is to know what's in it. And the way to do it is not to have somebody tell you what's in it, but to actually read it with others who are struggling to understand like you are, and together sharing insights and questions and conclusions. And once you've engaged in that process, you can become an informed citizen. Is that not what we mean by civic responsibility? Is that not what our republic is based upon? So in conclusion, we are at the bottom of the hour. It is 2:30 in the East. We have less than 30 minutes to go in today's program. Let me say, as I put the book Inventing America to the side, that I hope what we have been able to do over the last several weeks is not close the book on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, but open it by raising more questions than we've answered. That's my goal. That's the goal of the Virtual Center. That's the goal of the Head On Radio Network. I am not privy to the truth. Even if I were, I would be hesitant to present it to you as the truth. Because the only way you would accept it is if you accepted the fact that I was telling you the truth. I'm much more comfortable with you figuring out the truth for yourself. My job is to try to fill in some of the blanks and make sure that in your pursuit of truth, you have access to as much information as possible. In some cases, I can supply some of that information. In some cases, I can't. But that's what we're about. And what we want to do is engage in dialogue. What we want to do now is start to bat some of this stuff around. Kick this stuff back and forth. Throw some of it out in the air. Give some of it, air some of it to see if it floats, if it sticks. In the process, our understanding and appreciation of Thomas Jefferson and his Declaration of Independence will be enhanced. I mentioned yesterday, and I'd like to begin that now, and obviously we'll pursue this in much more detail tomorrow. I'd like to begin to look at the Constitution of the United States, which is 10 years later from Jefferson's Declaration, 11 years later. The Constitutional Convention, summer of 1787, Declaration of Independence, July 1776. We're talking 11 years here. In between, of course, is the so-called Confederation period and all that transpired during that period. And the history of that 10-year period is obviously a story in and of itself. We have made references to it. We have dabbled in it. We have talked about what other people say about it. We looked at John Fiske's book on the Confederation period. We looked at Jefferson's document on the vices of the American political system, in which he laid out 11 reasons why the Articles of Confederation had to be changed. And then we get, as you know, the Constitution of the United States as it comes out of the Summer Convention in 1787, and then that document goes through the process of ratification, requiring 9 states to ratify, and in ratification itself, in each of the states we have kind of a story in and of itself. And in one of the last states to address the issue of ratification of the Constitution, New York, Alexander Hamilton makes the decision to begin writing a series of papers which we've called, after the fact, the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers are generally considered to be classics in explaining the operation of the American political system as laid out in the Constitution of the United States. The important thing to mention here is the political context. It's impossible to understand any of this unless we recognize the political context within which it is happening. The Federalist Papers are not efforts by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton to explain objectively how the Constitution of the United States will work. The purpose of the Federalist Papers is to convince the citizens of New York that the fears that they've been exposed to about the Constitution are unfounded, and that the document itself contains the kinds of internal checks and internal balances that makes the threats and the fears of those most outspoken in opposition to the Constitution meaningless. In other words, the Federalist Papers are an 18th century example of sophisticated marketing. They are written on a level, as we've talked so many times, that requires incredible insight and incredible reading skill. Obviously, they are not written on a level that the average person can read and understand. It would be nice to believe that the framers, the people who wrote the Federalist Papers, were trying to communicate with the people, but they just wrote over their heads. But we know that's not true. We know that the authors of the Federalist Papers, we know that Publius, irrespective of which particular person wrote the particular paper in question, Publius, who wrote them all, was aiming argument and logic at a certain level, a group of people who could understand what the issues were.
Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob.
May I ask a question, please?
You certainly may.
This is one of those wheel-spinning moments.
Okay.
You're very good at that. Can I take it from what you're suggesting here, then, that every time some right-wing think tank hauls out Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Papers, or the right wing of the Supreme Court cites to them, flogging away at them as some sort of manifestation of a so-called original intent, that the Federalist Papers' own existence is contrary to that? That they're not laying out some sort of commentary? I mean, based on what you said, they're not saying how it's supposed to work. They're making an argument in favor of its ratification.
Right. They are arguing for its ratification. They are trying to alleviate the fears based on the specific challenges that opponents of the Constitution, the anti-federalists, are making to it. In other words, they're responding to particular challenges, but their overall intent is to alleviate the fears and the concerns of the average people, of the average person.
But do you see the nature of the question I'm asking?
I think I do. I think what you're suggesting, well, maybe I don't. I am so accustomed, and I think many of us are who pay attention to this sort of thing, to having people haul out the Federalist Papers as if it is some sort of Bible,
Talmudic comment on what on what the law is.
Right. The Federalist Papers the Federalist Papers, as a publication of 85 individual papers, is a political document. It is written for a political purpose. And its purpose is to secure the ratification of the Constitution of the United States by reassuring people that their fears are unfounded, and at the same time by communicating with the best people to suggest how it will actually work. And so in a sense, you're making two arguments. The Federalist Papers are in essence making two arguments at the same time. They're talking to two different groups of people on two different levels.
But is it a definitive statement of what the framers wanted the Constitution to be understood as going forward? Legally. interpreted in a court?
No, I don't think so. I think that in some ways, Bob, it's idealistic. Let me give you an example, and maybe this example will answer your question. Gary Wills is one of many. I mean, I've made this statement as well. If Americans really understood Federalist 10 the way that Madison wrote it, the Constitution of the United States would never have been ratified. And the history of Federalist 10 is that very few people made anything of Federalist 10 never really saw the light of day until 1913 when Charles Beard wrote his economic interpretation. Because what Charles Beard was able to do was go back and dissect Federalist 10 in a way which had never been done and lay out a self-interested agenda for people who drafted and supported and voted for the Constitution that the nation had never been forced to confront before that. And the fact of the matter is, and we talked about this before some months ago, is that while people have done everything to deny Charles Beard, nobody has totally been able to refute him. They're able to challenge parts of his research, and they're able to go deeper into the same subjects he went in and find things which call into question some of his conclusions. But the fact of the matter is nobody has been able once and for all to say that we can now throw the last shovel of dirt on Charles Beard because his economic interpretation is dead. Nobody's been able to do that. Because if you read the Federalist 10 as Madison wrote it, there's absolutely no question that these kinds of conclusive possibilities are there. You can't deny that they're there. You may not want to believe that they are. But the fact of the matter is the evidence is too overwhelming that they might be. And people who can really read, if the average person could read Federalist 10, there's no way that the Constitution of the United States would have been ratified.
Wow.
Nope, there's no way. And Gary Wills makes the point, and I think it's an absolutely brilliant point, that Madison is very fortunate that people didn't get into Federalist 10 at the time.
So whether it's being done by the left or the right in modern context, Dr. Bill, should people cue up a little bit of native skepticism anytime someone starts arguing that the Constitution means X because Federalist Y says Z?
Right. Federalist Y says it, but you got to realize that Federalist Y says what the authors of it wanted people to believe about it.
The Constitution then must be judged within the four corners of its own documentary universe, not by some orbiting satellite of commentary by Madison or Hamilton or John Jay.
One of the things that, and I'm kind of obviously way ahead of myself here, Bob.
Oh, I'm sorry. I really.
No, but that's okay. No. I wanted. You didn't take me off in the weeds at all. But I want to. I want to be accurate here, and I don't know that I can lay my hands on the exact statement that I want to lay my hands on. But the fact of the matter is, there are three, and right now I'm struggling to find the papers, but there are three Federalist Papers that are rarely looked at. They're, 37, 40, and 44. And nobody reads. I mean, these are considered not to be the key ones, like 51 and 10 and 78 and all of those. And Gary Wills makes the point that if you read these three Federalist Papers, 37, 40, and 44, which I propose that we do here. You cannot conclude that reading without recognizing that the authors of the Federalist Papers intended the Constitution of the United States to be a living document. In other words, what Gary Wills is saying...
Is that then why they are ignored?
Yes. What Gary Wills is saying, I think they were ignored for the most part because most people don't even bother reading them, but those people who, the Scalias and the Robert Borks and all the rest of them, who are pushing the idea of original intent, deny the realities of the living Constitution. What they claim is that a runaway Supreme Court over the years has so interpreted the Constitution of the United States that an inordinate level of power has been granted to the federal government that the framers never intended that they have. And that the only way to accurately measure the constitutionality of any piece of legislation is to weigh it against the original intent of the framers who wrote it and voted for it. And the fact of the matter is, if you read these three Federalist Papers, Gary Wills is betting that you're going to come away from this saying Justice Scalia is full of baloney. Because there's no question, if you read these three papers, and they're written, all three of them written by Madison, there's no question that Madison intended the Constitution of the United States to be a volatile living document that contained enough places where the literal meaning of the Constitution was general enough that a court could interpret the Constitution in such a way that it became able to address problems in a changing, developing world. I mean, that's the issue. Now, I don't think that, Scalia I'm sure Scalia's read the Federalist Papers, but I don't think he's in a contest to, set out to bury Federalist 37, 40, and 44.
No, he's just the typical.
He's just playing on the fact that nobody ever looks at them.
Yeah, and he chooses those things which support his argument, and
right.
tries to minimize those things which do not.
Right.
Now, this is intellectually disingenuous, but it is not surprising.
No, and I guess So I guess what I'm saying is yeah, you can go back and say the Constitution of the United States means this because James Madison in Federalist number 62 says it does. That implies that as you use the word Talmud, I use the word scripture or Bible or whatever. How about Quran? Let's say Quran. But anyway, the Federalist Papers are not holy writ. They are not, they are not holy scripture. And they were never intended to be. They were arguments put forth by attorneys, by sophisticated word masters. One of the most interesting things is the speed. I mean, if you think about it, all of these papers were written in a relatively brief period. Gary Wills makes the point that in order to crank out the Federalist Papers, all 85 of them, most of them, I think 77 of the 85 were written by Madison and Hamilton. Jay only wrote about 6 or 7. And actually the bulk of them by Hamilton. What Wills points out is that in today's world, Gary Wills was cranking out daily, a couple of thousand words. I mean, he was cranking out one of these documents every couple of days. I mean, that's incredible, given the sophisticated level at which they're written.
Well, and given the physical limitations on creating documents.
Oh my God! I mean, it's just amazing.
No, go get a feather and a pot of ink and some parchment, and write a 2,000-word essay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, the actual physicality of doing that.
2,000 words is not easy with Microsoft Word or Pages on a Mac.
This is, Bob, this is from the prologue to Explaining America to Gary Wills, but it gives detail. I was going to begin with this, and this is a good place to start. This is a hell of a paragraph. The 84 essays, he said, when they appeared in book form, there were 85, are, among other things, a marvel of mental energy. 2 men turned out 71 of these essays in just over 6 months. The run of papers from number 6 through number 77, minus Jay's one contribution in this span. Essays as trenchant in thought as they are graceful in expression. Hamilton, the begetter of the whole scheme, was lightning fast with his quill, assuming a dizzying variety of classical names. No one on either side of the Atlantic turned out more pamphlets of a high quality than Hamilton. But in the Federalist, he outdid even himself. And Madison, slower to write and slower to speak, drew on the deep reserves of learning acquired in preparation for the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Though Hamilton was busy with his law firm, and Madison with his duties in the Continental Congress, these men found time to compose their essays while maneuvering with friends and foes during a time of distraction and debate. As Douglas Adair notes in the 1940s, the great project went forward for half a year at an average of 1,000 well-chosen words every single day. It is enough to make all other writers on politics despair.
That's amazing. Well,
what a paragraph.
Yeah, Wills is no slack as a writer either.
No, that's well written. But my God, when you think about that, Bob, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. 1,000 words a day.
And they're not 1,000 monosyllabic.
Oh no, this is not what I did at Uncle John's farm last summer or anything like that.
And these are sentences with clauses and dependent clauses with dependent clauses.
And they are reasoned arguments, and they draw on the sources, and they quote Hume, and they quote all of these sources, Montesquieu and Rousseau, and I mean, it's just amazing what these papers represent. And this is in the Philadelphia newspaper called the Freeman's Journal. And here's a letter that appeared in the Philadelphia Journal during ratification. And it says, Publius has already written 26 numbers, as much as would jade the brains of any poor sinner, so that in decency he should now rest on his arms and let the people draw their breath for a while. That was written in December 12th, 1787. But then Gary Wills says, but Publius was just getting a second wind after the first 26 essays. The numbers appeared in 4 of the 5 New York City newspapers, prompting this lament to the New York Journal. We take McLean to read Publius in the best edition, and he gives us 2 at a time, and Charles for the Daily News and advertisements. But they are curtailed, and we are disappointed, for the purpose of serving up the same Publius at our expense. Loudon we take for his morality and evangelic sentiments, but here again we are imposed upon by being made to pay for the very same Publius, who has become nauseous by having been served up to us no less than in 2 other papers on the same day. I mean, this stuff was filling all the papers. It was kind of like Christina Underwood. You couldn't change the channel and get rid of it. It was everywhere. I mean, what a campaign. I mean,
what a brutal comparison, though, Dr.
Yeah,
Bill.
that's pretty bad. Yeah, Hamilton would roll in his grave on that one. But it's absolutely, I mean, it's just unbelievable, the campaign that is taking place. And the average people can't understand. I mean, the reaction to these things is they're not saying, oh, now I understand, or anything like that. They're saying, this is overwhelming. I can't read. There's no way in the world any human being could read and digest all of this stuff. Are they superhuman? Where's it? I mean, this is the most amazing I mean, this makes selling cars easy, you know, or houses or anything else. I mean, this is amazing. But that's what the Federalist Papers are about, and I think it's very important that we realize that. And it doesn't do a disservice to them at all. In fact, it makes even more unbelievable what they were able to do. And of course, the fact of the matter is, and I think Wills makes this point, and I mean, this is a point that everybody knows, when the New York Convention, ratifying convention met, the Anti-Federalists had the majority. So you have to conclude that the 85 Federalist Papers were a failure. They didn't work. They did not cause voters to send mostly Federalists to the New York ratifying convention, because most of the people who went were Anti-Federalists. And I would guess that the reason for that is because most people really couldn't understand this stuff.
And within the context of the New York Convention, let's remember that the man who would become Hamilton's utter and absolute nemesis, Aaron Burr, was there, was he not?
Yes, he was at the ratifying convention. He indeed was. And, you know, I mean, I think it's, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I mean, and I keep thinking back to kids in school and saying nobody can understand this stuff, it's dry and all. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that people need to hear, I think. It's just, I mean, it's just this is all basic information, but it's so important because you don't have to have Washington cutting down cherry trees in order to consider him to be a great American. All you have to do is look at this stuff. You know, exactly. I mean, this is amazing. I mean,
I apologize for taking you off the beaten path.
Don't apologize. This is great, Bob. And we're actually we better get out of here.
I'm going to let you wrap up.
Okay, let me wrap up because we only got 2 minutes to go. Thanks, Bob. Well, we've concluded another day here at the Virtual Center. It's 58 minutes after the hour, and I want to make sure that we're out of the way so that our next program here at the Head On Radio Network can begin. We'll be back tomorrow, and I'll give you a preview in case you have a chance to look at it. What I want to address tomorrow, I want to look at Hamilton's speech to the convention, to the Constitutional Convention, delivered on the 18th of June, 1787. If you go to the internet and you Google Madison's notes on the Federal Convention, you will get a breakdown of Madison's notes on a day-by-day. Just click June 18th. The entire day is comprised of a speech from Alexander Hamilton. I want us to look in depth at that speech. We'll do that tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Be careful. Take care of yourselves. And thank you for supporting the Head On Radio Network and the Virtual Center. I'm Bill O'Brien. Take care.